The 10 fastest muscle cars of the 1970s that were erased from history. The 1970s were supposed to be the golden age of American muscle cars. Big block V8s, high-octane fuel, and unrestrained horsepower roaring down the streets. But behind the scenes, something sinister was happening. While legends like the Chevelle SS454, the HEMI Cuda, and the Mustang Boss 429 became icons, other muscle cars, just as fast, just as powerful, were erased from history. Some were silenced by government regulations, others were sabotaged by their own manufacturers, and a few were simply too ahead of their time. Detroit's Big Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, weren't just competing against each other. They were fighting against rising insurance costs, emissions restrictions, and corporate greed that dictated which cars lived and which ones were buried. Some of these machines were faster than the muscle cars we remember today, yet they were quietly pushed aside, discontinued, or forgotten. The question is, why? Today, we're pulling these forgotten beasts out of the shadows. These aren't just fast cars. These are the muscle cars that were too powerful, too dangerous, and too disruptive for their own good. Buckle up, because some of these names might shock you. And stick around until the end, because we saved the most unbelievable car for last. One that could have changed the entire future of American muscle. Which one of these lost legends would you bring back? Drop your pick in the comments. And if you love discovering hidden muscle car history, hit that like button and subscribe to Muscle Car Masters, because we're just getting started. The 1973 Pontiac Firebird Formula 455 Super Duty. The 1973 Pontiac Firebird Formula 455 Super Duty was more than just a muscle car. It was Pontiac's last stand against GM's performance restrictions. At a time when government emissions regulations and rising insurance premiums were crippling high-horsepower cars, Pontiac refused to surrender. While other manufacturers were detuning their engines, Pontiac engineers pushed the limits, creating a power plant that defied the trend. But the SD455 didn't just survive. It threatened to redefine the muscle car era. The SD455 was a nightmare for GM's corporate structure. It was too good. Engineers managed to build a 455 cubic inch V8 that met emissions requirements without sacrificing brutal acceleration. In independent tests, the Firebird Formula 455 outperformed high-end sports cars like the Porsche 911, ripping through the quarter mile in 13.75 seconds at 103.56 miles per hour. Pontiac had managed to create a muscle car that was both legal and lightning fast, a combination that should have secured its place as the king of American performance. But there was one problem. It was faster than the Corvette. At GM, the Corvette was sacred. It was supposed to be the company's flagship performance car, the one that could hold its own against European exotics. The idea of a Firebird beating a Corvette in a straight line was unthinkable to GM's top executives. According to insider reports, Pontiac had even developed an ultra-high output version of the SD455 that exceeded 500 horsepower, a prototype that never saw production. Was this a case of corporate sabotage? Did GM intentionally kill off what could have been America's fastest muscle car of the 1970s? Let us know in the comments, because this isn't just muscle car history. It's a glimpse at what could have been. 1978 Dodge Magnum XE400. The 1978 Dodge Magnum XE400 wasn't built to be just another road-going cruiser. It was a street-legal NASCAR. With its aggressively sloped front end, hidden headlights, and a wide, planted stance. This car was designed with aerodynamics in mind. Dodge knew that if they couldn't win the muscle car war in the streets anymore, they could still dominate on the track. And that's exactly what they tried to do. Richard Petty himself raced a Dodge Magnum in NASCAR, proving it had real high-speed potential. But while the race versions were fast, the street version was already outdated before it hit the showroom. Under the hood, the Magnum XE was available with the 400 cubic inch big block V8, making 190 to 225 horsepower depending on the configuration. But the writing was on the wall. This was the last Dodge to feature Chrysler's legendary big block engines. Just a year later, the 400 and 440 V8s were gone forever, marking the end of an era. The Magnum had the looks, the history, and the aerodynamics, but it was too little, too late. Muscle cars were already a dying breed, and Chrysler was shifting its focus away from high horsepower performance. 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. Buick was never supposed to be a muscle car contender. General Motors had clear boundaries. Chevrolet was the performance king, Pontiac was the street fighter, and Buick was meant for luxury. But in 1970, Buick broke the rules and built the GSX Stage 1, a muscle car so powerful it shook GM's brand strategy. At its core was a 455 cubic inch V8, officially rated at 360 horsepower and 510 pound-feet of torque. But insiders knew those numbers were downplayed. Real-world tests suggested it made over 400 horsepower, rocketing from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 5.5 seconds, faster than a Dodge Charger 446 pack or a Plymouth HEMI CUDA. This wasn't just Buick's fastest car, it was one of the fastest muscle cars of the era. So why isn't the GSX a household name? Because GM buried it. Unlike the Chevelle SS or the GTO, the GSX received no major advertising. Pontiac and Dodge pushed aggressive marketing for their muscle cars, while Buick's dealerships barely mentioned the GSX. GM wanted Buick to remain a luxury brand, not a performance brand. The real tragedy? Buick had an even hotter version in the works. Rumors suggest a solid lifter, high compression 455 Stage 1 was tested, pushing 450-plus horsepower, but GM shut it down. Was the GSX a victim of corporate suppression? And if Buick had fully embraced muscle cars, how would that have changed GM's history? Drop your thoughts in the comments. 1971 Dodge Super B 446 pack. By 1971, the muscle car landscape was changing fast. The insurance industry had declared war on high-performance vehicles, government restrictions were increasing, and fuel efficiency concerns were starting to take hold. But Dodge still had one more trick up its sleeve: the 1971 Super B 446 pack, a muscle car built for pure, unfiltered speed at a time when the writing was already on the wall for big block monsters. This wasn't just another Mopar, it was a budget-friendly street brawler. The 446 pack, with its triple Holley 2-barrel carburetors, unleashed 385 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, figures that many believe were underrated by Dodge. The aggressive camshaft, heavy-duty 4-speed manual transmission, and 391-to-1 rear axle ratio made this car a nightmare for unsuspecting rivals at stoplights. Its quarter-mile time of 13.8 seconds at over 100 miles per hour proved that Dodge could still deliver knockout punches even as regulations loomed. But while the Super B had the power, it lacked a strong brand identity. Unlike the Charger and Challenger, which had their own marketing push and devoted followings, the Super B was always positioned as a budget muscle car, a sleeper that Dodge never fully backed. While its rivals got flashy ads and Hollywood appearances, the Super B was left to survive on word of mouth and underground street credibility. 1970 AMC Rebel Machine. In the muscle car wars of the 1970s, reputation was everything. Ford, Chevy, and Dodge had name recognition, massive marketing budgets, and racing pedigree to back up their performance claims. AMC? They had none of that. But in 1970, AMC fought back with the Rebel Machine, a muscle car that could go toe-to-toe with Detroit's best, yet was doomed from the start. The Rebel machine wasn't just another muscle car, it was a loud, rebellious statement. It debuted in a red, white, and blue paint scheme, a marketing stunt designed to grab attention. But under the flashy exterior lurked a 390 cubic-inch V8, cranking out 340 horsepower and 430 pound-feet of torque. With a 0 to 60 time of 6.3 seconds and a quarter-mile run in 14.4 seconds, it could outrun a Chevelle SS 396 or a Mustang Mach 1 351. So why did it fail? AMC's biggest weakness wasn't the car, it was the dealers. Unlike Dodge or Chevy, AMC's dealership network was built for selling economy cars, not high-performance street machines. Many dealers didn't understand how to sell the Rebel machine, and without strong advertising, most customers didn't even know it existed. 1970, Mercury Cyclone, spoiler 429, CJ. In 1970, Ford wasn't just competing with Chevrolet and Dodge, it was competing with itself. Mercury, Ford's own division, built a faster, better-handling muscle car than the Torino Cobra, and Ford let it die to protect its flagship model. That car was the Cyclone spoiler 429 Cobra Jet, a high-performance beast that was buried in obscurity. Under the hood, the Cyclone packed the 429 Cobra Jet V8, officially rated at 370 horsepower, but rumored to produce nearly 400. Equipped with a 4-speed manual transmission, competition suspension, and a 350-to-1 rear axle, this machine could hit 0 to 60 miles per hour in 6.2 seconds and run the quarter mile in 14.1 seconds at 100 miles per hour. But its biggest advantage? Aerodynamics. Unlike the bulkier Torino, the Cyclone spoiler had a functional hood scoop, chin spoiler, and rear wing, giving it superior high-speed stability. So why didn't this car become a legend? Because it was too good. Ford had already spent millions promoting the Torino Cobra, and the Cyclone spoiler threatened to steal the spotlight. To ensure Torino sales stayed strong, Ford barely marketed the Cyclone, limited its production, and denied it the full drag pack treatment. That package, reserved for the Torino, came with stronger internals, an 11.3-to-1 compression ratio, and a 430-to-1 Detroit locker rear axle, upgrades that could have made the Cyclone one of the fastest muscle cars Ford ever built. 1971, Plymouth GTX 446 pack. By 1971, Plymouth faced a tough decision. The GTX had started as a high-end muscle car with a luxury touch, but the market was shifting. Buyers wanted raw performance at lower prices, and the Roadrunner had stolen much of its thunder. Instead of giving up, Plymouth engineers loaded the GTX with one of the meanest power plants Mopar ever built, the 446 pack. This wasn't just any big block, it was a race-ready setup. The triple-carb 446 pack delivered 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, numbers that many believed were underrated. The 0 to 60 time of 5.5 seconds and a quarter-mile run of 13.7 seconds at 102 miles per hour put it on par with muscle car royalty. Paired with either a Torque Flight 727 automatic or a 4-speed manual, the GTX had the brute force to dominate stoplight showdowns and drag strips alike. But despite its firepower, the GTX was a muscle car without a clear identity. The Roadrunner had already captured the youth market, while the Dodge Charger RT carried the luxury muscle flag. The GTX, sitting somewhere in between, got lost in the mix. It wasn't lack of power that killed it. It was Chrysler's shifting priorities and internal competition. By the end of 1971, the GTX was discontinued as a standalone model, with its name reduced to an option package on the Roadrunner. 1975, Chevrolet Laguna S3 400. The 1975 Chevrolet Laguna S3 400, a car inspired by NASCAR dominance but crippled before it could truly shine. At first glance, the Laguna S3 didn't look like the muscle cars of the past. It wasn't a Chevelle SS or a Camaro Z28, it was something different. Its sleek, wind-tunnel-tested front end was built specifically for high-speed stability, making it one of the best-handling muscle cars of the decade. NASCAR legend Cale Yarborough piloted a Laguna to multiple victories, proving that this car had serious performance potential. Under the hood, Chevrolet gave it a 400 cubic inch small block V8, making 245 horsepower, a decent number, but far from the glory days of the LS6 Chevelle. The problem? Government-mandated emissions controls choked the life out of it before it ever had a chance. Had this been just a few years earlier, the Laguna S3 could have been a monster. Imagine if GM had fought back against emissions regulations, refining the small block instead of detuning it. The Laguna had the chassis and aerodynamics to dominate. All it needed was a high-compression, high-output power plant to make it a real muscle car. Instead, GM chose to comply rather than compete, and the Laguna was left to be a footnote in Chevrolet's performance history. So here's the question. What if GM had pushed back? What if they had engineered a way around emissions laws instead of neutering their performance cars? Let us know in the comments. Was this the muscle car that could have saved GM's street performance division? 1971 Ford Torino Cobra 429 SCJ. By 1971, Ford had a muscle car problem, but not in the way you'd expect. While other manufacturers were struggling to keep up with government regulations, Ford had a different issue: too many muscle cars competing for attention. The Mustang, the Cougar, the Cyclone, and the Torino all shared overlapping performance packages, leading to one of Ford's fastest cars being completely overlooked: the 1971 Torino Cobra 429 Super Cobra Jet. At its core, the Torino Cobra 429 SCJ was an absolute street beast. Under the hood sat Ford's most powerful big block of the era. Equipped with high-flow heads, a solid lifter camshaft, and a functional Ram air shaker hood scoop, this engine was built to dominate. With 375 factory-rated horsepower, widely believed to be underrated, the Torino Cobra could rocket down the quarter-mile in just 14.1 seconds. Numbers that put it in the same league as legendary muscle cars like the Chevelle SS 454 and the Dodge Challenger RT 446 pack. But despite its raw power, the Torino Cobra never got the recognition it deserved. Why? Because Ford buried it in its bloated 1971 lineup. The Torino came in 14 different versions, from family sedans to wagons, making it easy for the high-performance Cobra model to get lost in the mix. Worse yet, Ford was prioritizing the Mustang as its flagship muscle car, leaving the Torino to be an afterthought in advertising and dealership promotions. While Dodge was putting its weight behind the Charger RT and GM was pushing the Chevelle SS, Ford's Torino Cobra faded into the background, despite having the muscle to compete. 1977 Pontiac Can-Am. Sometimes a great muscle car is killed by regulations. Sometimes it's buried by corporate politics. But the 1977 Pontiac Can-Am, it was erased by something far more ridiculous: a broken mold. But let's back up, because the Can-Am wasn't just another late 70s performance car. It was Pontiac's last stand against the muscle car decline. Built as a high-performance version of the Le Mans, the Can-Am packed a 400 cubic inch V8, borrowed straight from the Pontiac Trans Am, making 200 horsepower and 325 pound-feet of torque. Serious numbers for 1977. If you were lucky enough to live outside of California, you could even get the Oldsmobile 403 V8, offering slightly more power. With a turbo 400 automatic transmission, a shaker hood scoop, and an aggressive stripe package, The Can-Am looked like a street fighter and ran like one too. But despite its NASCAR-inspired design and muscle car roots, the Can-Am was doomed before it could take off. Pontiac planned to build 5,000 units, but after producing just 1,377, the mold for the car's distinctive rear spoiler broke. Instead of spending the money to repair it or continue production, Pontiac simply walked away, killing the Can-Am overnight. Some say it was an excuse, that Pontiac never fully believed in the car in the first place. Others believe that internal GM politics kept Pontiac from fully pushing its performance cars, fearing they would overshadow Chevrolet's lineup. Either way, the Can-Am vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. These weren't just fast cars. These were muscle cars that should have been legends. Machines engineered for pure speed, but instead buried by corporate greed, government regulations, and internal rivalries. Some were too powerful for their own good. Some were forgotten because they didn't fit into a manufacturer's marketing plan. And some were simply victims of bad timing. But the real question is, what if history had been different? Imagine if these machines had been properly marketed, given the development they deserved, and allowed to reach their full potential. Would we still be in a golden age of big block power today? Would the Torino Cobra have stolen the Mustang's spotlight? Would the Buick GSX Stage 1 have rewritten GM's muscle car history? And what if Pontiac had fought harder to keep the Can-Am alive? The fate of muscle cars could have been completely different. Now, we turn it over to you. Which of these muscle cars do you think got screwed over the worst? And did we miss any that should have made the list? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you love uncovering lost muscle car history, hit that like button. Subscribe to Muscle Car Masters and turn on notifications, because the truth is just getting started.